When people consider national debt, they often picture it as money owed to distant foreign powers or large international institutions. The idea is straightforward. One country borrows from another or from global investors far removed from daily life. Yet across history, a quieter observation emerges. In many periods, the creditors of governments have been found much closer to home, through domestic merchants in ancient times, wealthy citizens in medieval city-states, or institutions managing the savings of ordinary people in later eras. From Renaissance Venice, where local bondholders financed their own republic's ventures, to early modern England, where landowners purchased government securities, the pattern has often been one of internal obligation rather than external dependence. This leads to a calm and enduring question. When a nation owes money largely within its own society, what does that debt truly represent about trust and shared responsibility over time? The notion of debt as obligation stretches back thousands of years. In ancient Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets recorded loans of barley and silver between merchants and temples. These were not abstract transactions. They were personal agreements, enforceable by social standing and religious authority. To default meant loss of reputation, sometimes loss of freedom. Debt was woven into the fabric of community life. In Rome, creditors were often patrician families who lent to the state during military campaigns. These families expected repayment not merely in coin but in political influence and land grants. Lending to the Republic was an act of both finance and statecraft. The creditor and the state were not separate entities, they were intertwined, each sustaining the other. Medieval Europe carried forward this intimacy. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa financed wars and trade expeditions through bonds purchased by wealthy merchants and guilds. These bonds, known as prestiti or compere, were held domestically. The citizens who bought them were also the citizens who benefited from military victories and expanded trade routes. The relationship was circular. The state borrowed from its people to protect and enrich those same people. In this worldview, debt was not a burden imposed by outsiders. It was a mutual obligation, a shared risk. Trust was the currency. A government that defaulted on domestic creditors risked internal collapse, not because of economic mechanics alone, but because it broke the implicit contract with its own society. Banking families like the Medici in Florence understood this deeply. They lent to kings and popes, but they also held the deposits of local merchants and artisans. Their survival depended on maintaining trust across all layers of society. When trust fractured, so did their empires. This historical context is essential. For most of human history, the line between creditor and citizen was blurred. Lending to the state was an investment in the community's future. The alternative, foreign creditors, carried different risks. Foreign lenders might have conflicting interests. They might demand harsher terms. They might withdraw support during crises. So societies, when they could, preferred to owe money to themselves. This was not policy in the modern sense. It was instinct shaped by centuries of experience. The pattern would repeat again and again, even as the scale and complexity of debt grew far beyond anything a Mesopotamian temple or Venetian merchant could have imagined. The architecture of modern sovereign debt began to take recognizable form in 1694 when the English government chartered the Bank of England. The context was war, specifically the 9 Years' War against France. King William III needed funds urgently. Traditional methods of raising money, taxation, and borrowing from goldsmiths were insufficient. A group of London merchants proposed a solution. They would lend the government £2 million at 8% interest. In exchange, they would receive a royal charter to operate as a bank with the ability to issue notes backed by that government debt. The arrangement was circular from the start. The bank's existence depended on government borrowing, and the government's borrowing created the bank. Crucially, the initial subscribers were domestic. They were English merchants, landowners, and financiers. The debt was owed to people who lived under the same sovereign authority, who shared the same legal system, whose wealth and security depended on the stability of the English state. This was not accidental. Domestic creditors had aligned interests. They wanted the government to succeed because their own fortunes were tied to it. Over the following century, this model spread. Other European nations established similar institutions. The pattern remained consistent. Governments preferred to borrow domestically when possible. Domestic creditors were easier to negotiate with during crises. They could be appealed to through shared national identity. They could be repaid in the currency the government itself controlled. By the 19th century, the scale had grown immensely. The Napoleonic Wars left Britain with national debt exceeding 200% of GDP. Who held this debt? Largely British citizens through government bonds called consols purchased by landlords, merchants, and eventually the emerging middle class. The British state owed money to the British people. When the government paid interest, it was transferring wealth within the society, not outside it. This dynamic shaped perceptions. Domestic debt felt different from foreign debt. It was still a burden, still required taxation to service, but it did not involve surrender of wealth to outsiders. The money stayed within the economy, circulating from taxpayers to bondholders, many of whom were taxpayers themselves. The 20th century brought central banks into sharper focus. The United States Federal Reserve, established in 1913, gradually became a major holder of U.S. government debt. After World War II, this accelerated. Central banks began purchasing government bonds as a tool of monetary policy, lowering interest rates, managing inflation, and stabilizing financial systems. Here the circle tightened further. A government borrows by issuing bonds. Its own central bank buys those bonds. The central bank pays for them by creating reserves, essentially by expanding the money supply. The interest the government pays on those bonds flows back to the central bank, which then remits most of that interest back to the government as profit. In substance, the government was lending to itself. The accounting was real, the obligations were real, but the ultimate creditor was an institution created by and for the government. This was not a secret. It was openly discussed in economic policy circles. Yet the public language around national debt often obscured this reality, and so the pattern held. The other end of the debt, more often than not, was held by the society itself. The preference for domestic creditors is not merely a historical curiosity. It reflects deeper patterns of human behavior and systemic logic. First, there is the matter of trust and alignment. Lending money requires belief that the borrower will repay. When the borrower is a government, that belief rests on assumptions about stability, legal integrity, and future capacity. Domestic creditors share the fate of the government. If the state collapses or defaults, they lose not only their investment but also the security of their property, the functioning of their economy, and the value of their currency. This shared risk creates alignment. Foreign creditors, by contrast, can walk away. They can sell their holdings, move capital elsewhere, hedge their exposure through currency markets. They are not embedded in society. Their losses are financial, not existential. For governments, this introduces fragility. A sudden withdrawal of foreign capital can trigger currency crises, force austerity, destabilize entire economies. History is filled with such episodes. Latin American debt crises in the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the European sovereign debt troubles of the 2010s all involved significant foreign creditor exposure. When confidence wavered, capital fled. Governments were left scrambling, negotiating with international institutions, imposing painful reforms. Countries with primarily domestic debt rarely faced such dynamics. They could negotiate with their own banks, restructure obligations internally, manage crises without the pressure of foreign demands. The difference was not merely technical, it was structural. Domestic creditors had fewer options for exit and governments had more room to maneuver. This explains why even in an era of globalized finance, many large economies maintain predominantly domestic debt profiles. It is a buffer, a form of financial sovereignty. The trade-off is that domestic creditors must be kept confident. Inflation, political instability, fiscal mismanagement all erode trust, but the erosion happens more slowly, and recovery is possible through internal negotiation. A second pattern involves the role of central banks. Once central banks began purchasing government debt at scale, the nature of sovereign borrowing shifted. The government could issue bonds knowing its own central bank stood ready to buy them. This reduced reliance on private markets, lowered borrowing costs, and provided extraordinary flexibility during crises. The 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic illustrated this. Governments issued trillions in debt. Central banks absorbed much of it through quantitative easing and emergency lending programs. The process was smooth because the creditor was, in effect, an arm of the state itself. Critics noted the risks, potential inflation, asset bubbles, and moral hazard. Yet the immediate benefit was undeniable. Governments could act swiftly, funding relief programs and stabilizing economies without waiting for private investors to absorb the debt. This was the ultimate expression of the circular pattern. The government borrowed, the central bank lent, the interest payments looped back. The public owed debt to institutions that in turn returned the proceeds to the public coffers. The pattern, repeated across centuries, reveals a consistent human preference. When possible, societies choose to owe money to themselves. The reasons are practical: stability, control, shared risk. The outcome is a financial system where the creditor is often a mirror of the debtor. The echoes of this pattern extend beyond the obvious examples of England, Japan, or the United States. They appear in quieter forms, in periods where institutional memory fades but the behavior persists. Consider post-war reconstruction efforts. After both world wars, European governments faced enormous debts. Much of it was held domestically, by citizens who had bought war bonds out of patriotism, by banks that had financed military production, by pension systems that had absorbed government securities. The repayment of this debt involved internal transfers of wealth, shaped by inflation, taxation, and selective defaults. In West Germany, the 1953 London Debt Agreement restructured both external and internal obligations. The internal portion owed to German citizens and institutions was handled through negotiated settlements and currency reforms. The process was painful but manageable because the creditors were embedded in the rebuilding society. Their incentive was recovery, not extraction. Similarly, France and Italy managed large domestic debts through inflation and financial repression. Interest rates on government bonds were kept below inflation, eroding the real value of the debt. Savers lost purchasing power, but the alternative, default or harsh austerity, would have been more destabilizing. The implicit contract held, the society absorbed the cost collectively. Later decades saw variations. Pension funds and insurance companies became major holders of government debt in developed economies. These institutions managed the retirement savings of millions. Their portfolios were filled with sovereign bonds, safe, stable, predictable. The citizens, through their pension contributions, were lending to the government. The government, through interest payments, was funding future retirements. This was not central planning. It was the aggregate outcome of individual decisions and institutional incentives. Pension managers sought safety. Government bonds provided it. The loop closed naturally. Even in emerging economies, where foreign debt played a larger role, the preference for domestic creditors appeared whenever conditions allowed. Countries that achieved macroeconomic stability and developed local capital markets gradually shifted toward domestic financing. The reasons remained timeless: control, stability, alignment of interests. The pattern, quiet and persistent, ran through modern financial history like a thread. The question posed at the beginning, who holds the other end of global debt, has a deceptively simple answer. More often than not, the creditor is the society itself. This is not universally true. Foreign creditors remain significant, especially for developing nations and during periods of fiscal stress. But the dominant pattern, across history and across major economies, is circularity. Governments borrow from domestic institutions, central banks, pension funds, insurance companies, commercial banks that are ultimately rooted in the citizenry. The debt is owed to the people, held in trust by institutions that serve the people, serviced by taxes paid by the people. The loop is tight and self-reinforcing. It carries risks, complacency, inflation, financial repression, but it also provides stability and sovereignty. The other end of debt is rarely as distant as it appears. It is often just across the room, held by the same society that debates how to manage it. Understanding this does not resolve the questions of sustainability or fairness. But it does shift the perspective. Debt is not merely an external obligation. It is a relationship within a society, reflecting choices about trust, risk, and shared fate, and that perhaps is the insight worth carrying forward. If this perspective shifted the way debt appears, there are other questions worth exploring. How do societies decide when to borrow? What role does inflation play in managing obligations? The history is deeper than headlines suggest. For now, thank you for listening. The details matter, and they are always worth the time.